What was the best tank of World War II? This quite common question is one of the most controversial ones in the casual history debate. If you go to Quora or Reddit, you will find a variety of answers. The Panther was the best. The Tiger was the best tank. Nothing comes close to T-34 thanks to its numbers. These are the most common examples of answers that you would find. You can also find some occasional fanboyism that in extreme can look almost like that. But seriously, what really is the best tank? There are a few layers to this question. In this video, we are going to take a radically different approach than usual and look at something more than the raw data on paper. If we take a look at the tank as an individual fighting vehicle, then the things that matter the most are the firepower, mobility, and armor, or in other words, raw data about tank specification and its performance as a vehicle in real fighting conditions. Judging by this outlook, you would probably come to the conclusion that either Panther or Tiger tanks were the best during the Second World War. It just happens that these tanks are the most commonly nominated to the category of the best tank of World War II. However, this approach is deeply flawed as the tanks are not individual fighting vehicles but military assets. The tank value isn't determined by the performance of one tank on the battlefield, but by the strategic advantage that those tanks collectively provide for an army. In other words, to truly understand the tank value, you must judge it on the strategic scale and not on the tactical basics. This means that you must include aspects such as logistics, production costs and time, quantity and the potential for modernization. After all, if you are the army, you don't want to scrap half of your tanks suddenly because some rapid technological advancement made them completely obsolete. To demonstrate how an individual approach to a tank is flawed, let's take a quick look at the Panther tank. Panzerkampfwagen IV Panzer G weighs around 45.5 tons and is equipped with one 75mm KVK-42L/70 gun and two MG42 machine guns. The maximum speed is 55 km/h, and the front armor has up to 110mm. These specifications look brilliant on paper until you consider a few factors that are frequently overlooked. Firstly, this tank consumes 280 liters of petrol per 100 kilometers. The M4 Sherman tank uses 1 gallon to travel 1.4 miles, so if you convert this to kilometers, you would gain 1.68 liters per kilometer, so 168 liters per 100 kilometers. 60% of this would Panther need to run the same distance. Now, this might not seem as a big deal, but if you consider that you have thousands of tanks, it quickly turns out that you suddenly need a few hundred tons of fuel more simply because your individual tank burns more, and it just happens that you are the German army during 1944 or 1945, and you have almost no fuel at all. So, now it doesn't matter how good your individual tank is. You cannot use it properly because it burns more fuel than you can deliver, and after a few days of intense combat, your best tank is probably completely useless or is in the best case just an overpriced bunker. And this is simply a look at fuel consumption, something that you don't really take into account when you first look at the tank as an individual fighting vehicle. Much more complex things start to happen when you look at the production costs, shipping, or even things such as survivability of the crew. All of those small details create unimaginable consequences in the strategic perspective, as simply 1% difference in survivability may mean a few thousand additional losses during the duration of war. And to make matters even more complicated, all of those things are interconnected, creating a giant web of data, where the price of a mistake is paid in the human lives or even the outcome of war. Taking this into account, we can conclude that the best tank is a vehicle that has the most overall positive outcome on the strategic scale. In other words, it compromises on different things in the way that creates the most optimal performance, and in my opinion, it happens that the World War II tank that was the best compromise was a simple, humble Panzerkampfwagen IV. If you look at the Panzer IV tank from purely the specifications perspective, you will quickly come to the conclusion that Panzer IV by all means wasn't the best. But, as we had concluded earlier, specifications alone are not what matters the most. Our simple tank was developed in 1936 and had gradually evolved over the course of his usage. The tank's first version, the Ausf A, was protected by 14.5 mm of steel armor on the front plate of the chassis and 20 mm on the turret. 8 years later, the same tank in the Ausf A version had frontal armor of 80 mm, 550% more than the first version, and that adaptability of the design and its ability to improve gradually over the course of its existence is truly what made the Panzer IV into the best tank of the war. The overall design improvement wasn't limited to armor, but in the similar manner it had affected other vital parts of the design as well. This versatility of the design is an unachievable dream for many. Without the need for the constant change of the design, the logistics facilities behind the front are much more effective and do not need to adjust the whole structure of service just to accommodate different models. The universality of Panzer IV design, however, goes much beyond that. The crews of the previous versions knew exactly how to handle the retail tank. This, in contrast to, for example, tanks such as Tiger, means that the overall reliability of the tank in the field increases not only on paper, but also in reality. And this leads us to the next major point of the Panzer IV supremacy. Just as the Soviet T-34 tank was good enough, the Panzer IV was as well. The major difference, however, is that this tank was able to not only be good enough, but also get the job done, despite being extremely outnumbered. 8,553 tanks of all the variants of Panzer IV were built. For the contrast, the Allies managed to produce around 49,004 Sherman tanks. Despite this, German Panzer IVs were able not only to put up a hell of a fight with the Allied vehicles, but also more often than not, be able to win it. The Panzer IV, however, did not only prove to be a really good tank by itself, but also an excellent platform for all sorts of armored vehicles. The most notable of them were tank destroyers such as Sturmgeschütz IV or Jagdpanzer IV. These tank destroyers had proven to be extraordinarily effective and became an unprecedented source of support for many German units. The same was true for Brummbär or the Sturmpanzer 43, a direct infantry support assault gun armored with 15 cm Stu 43 Hotwizzer. Flakpanzer IV Wirbelwind, yet another vehicle based on the Panzer IV chassis, had also proven to be an effective vehicle in its role as the self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicle. Universality of the Panzer IV chassis was another great characteristic of the tank, as the success of the tank was not only visible in the original machine itself. In other words, the Panzer IV was not only a tank, but also a whole engineering platform with the great potential for further improvement. This is also of a great importance for the military, as it is simply much cheaper to have many vehicles based on the one basis, instead of the plethora of different unrelated equipment. As such, the Panzer IV again had been proven to be a great choice for a German military, as it could fill the multiple roles, thus being flexible and universal from both the small and big picture perspectives. The Panzer IV had also earned a positive opinion among the German soldiers. The infantrymen who were often assigned for operations with the Panzer IV loved her. When they were assigned with Tigers or Panthers, the big cats, they hated it, as the Allied scout planes and recon patrol keyed off on the big iron more than anything, and usually always funded, as they were almost impossible to camouflage from their large size and the columns of trucks with tons of fuel that they have required in order to operate on longer distances. However, Panzer IV wasn't without any flaws. The tank by the 1944 started to become more and more obsolete, as it turned out that the further upgrades, despite the tank's great adaptability, were becoming harder and harder, as the increase in weight of the tank would greatly overextend the already heavily exploited chassis of the tank. The pressure put on the Panzer IV chassis had been steadily increasing since the first modernization, as first variant A was at around 18 tons, while the variant A was already 25 tons heavy. The Panzer IV's adaptability was great, but at some point the construction, from 1936, had to simply reach its limits, and unfortunately for Germans, they had reached that moment before the end of the war. Yet, even when being almost 10 years old, with all the astonishing development that happened in this period, the tank was able to fight, sometimes on very unfavorable terms, with such tanks as T-34-85. The Panzer IV, of course, had other flaws, but most of them were related to the same problem: the overextension of the chassis as the development of new versions had progressed. For example, one of the most known flaws was the underpowered Maybach engine of the tank that was struggling with all of that extra weight. The transmission had also suffered from similar problems. However, none of that flaws was big enough to make the tank bad, as in contrast to some Allied tanks, the Panzer IV was a reliable and easy to repair tank that was able to get through even the worst of conditions the Russia had to offer, which for a machine designed with the usage in temperate climate in mind was a huge achievement in itself. In conclusion, Panzer IV wasn't the best tank per se, but was able to get the things done at a reasonable price when compared to other vehicles. The tank was easy to produce, repair and serve at the same time. It was reliable and didn't put a severe strain on the army logistically. The tank was also extremely adaptable, constantly evolving and improving to meet the changing battlefield, a thing that had proven to be a blessing for a German army. The chassis of the tank had also proven to be flexible enough to become almost a universal platform for other vehicles as well. From tank destroyers to self-propelled ATA vehicles, the chassis found its use for the German war industry. The tank had also gained a positive renown amongst the German soldiers themselves. Panzer IV may not have been the most numerous, well-armored vehicle, but it was the best the Germans had to offer, when taking the other non-combat factors into account, such as production, costs, or logistical issues. And in my opinion, this well-adjusted relation between each of the elements that truly make the tank best ruled supreme in this humble tank. Let me know in the comments what you think about this tank and the dilemma. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.